What if the White Army won the Russian Civil War and the Bolsheviks never came to power in Russia? As usual, we will look at some of the conditions that led to a Red Army victory and a White Army defeat to see what we can change and how we can produce a White Army victory before we look at the impact of a Bolshevik defeat. Obviously, one way to prevent a Bolshevik victory would be not having the Russian Revolution take place, but the revolution was coming since the Russo-Japanese War of 1904. Also, not having a Russian Revolution would mean no Russian Civil War, and that would have to be a completely different alternate history video, as this one is about the Russian Civil War. But the Bolsheviks were almost ended after the Russian Revolution by Sidney Riley, the ace of spies, in 1918 when the revolution was in its infancy. In April of 1918, Riley was going to arrest the entire Bolshevik leadership, but his plan was foiled by a Soviet crackdown that came about due to an unrelated assassination attempt on Lenin. But yeah, Riley almost ended the entire Bolshevik movement then, and that would definitely help ensure that the Red Army loses the Russian Civil War due to leadership disorganization. Next, we need to examine the state of the White Army during the Civil War. First of all, the White Movement itself was a big tent political movement, with factions ranging from left-wing to far-right. The only thing that united all of these different political factions and warlords was anti-Bolshevism. The military forces were not under a united command structure, and was more of a loose coalition of various warlords vying for power. Turning tables to the Red Army during the Civil War, the Reds had a more united command structure than the Whites. Not to say that Bolshevik groups were completely unified, but it was a lot more organized than the White Army was. The Reds also had plenty of internal purges during the Civil War, and both sides looted and terrorized their fair share of the civilian population. Separatists, nationalists, and other factions were kind of doing their own thing against both sides during the war. Poles, Ukrainians, Belarusians, Finns, Latvians, Lithuanians, Estonians, Freikorps, and other German paramilitaries, anarchists, anti-Bolshevik leftist groups such as Left SRs, the Green Army, Black Guards, Kronstadt rebels, and a lot of other groups I'm not going to mention did what they were doing during the Civil War. But the point is, the Whites fought some of these groups that they didn't need to fight, and they wasted their resources doing so. Another aspect of the Russian Civil War was the Allied intervention in Russia, which occurred in Siberia, northern Russia, southern Russia, and was made up of Entente forces from World War I. The British additionally conducted an intervention into the Baltic states to support independence movements, sent the Dunster Force to the Caucasus, and the Maelson mission to the Trans-Caspian Sea. Romania sent a force into Bessarabia, and Japan had their intervention in Russia with the Allies, but with the separate goal of creating client states in Siberia, which almost led to a war between the United States and Japan. Similar to the White Army, the Allied intervention had a variety of competing objectives, but another issue for the American intervention was that the people didn't really know why they were in Russia after the end of the Great War, and this feeling was generally felt by a lot of the Allied intervention forces. Also, some White Army generals and warlords were distrustful of Allied support and outright refused it, which further cost them the Civil War. So, how would the White Armies win the Russian Civil War? Well, we'll have the White Army become unified under a common goal of defeating the Bolsheviks and not have any infighting and turf wars between warlords. We'll also have the Whites ally with any separatist movement and anti-Bolshevik leftist group against the Bolsheviks that they can, except for anarchists, as there's no way of even a temporary alliance between those two working out. We can also increase the Allied support for White Russia and suppress separate Allied goals in Russia. Something else that we'll throw into the mix is changing an aspect of the Kronstadt Rebellion. The Kronstadt sailors were the most revolutionary force within the Bolshevik movement, but even the Bolsheviks saw them as too radical and fought against them in our timeline, but suppressed any information about it getting out. In this alternate timeline, the fighting is publicized and the Bolshevik movement loses some of its steam and momentum and even sees some levels of infighting. The Russian Civil War is basically like Warlord China, but in Russia and with White Army generals. They could possibly unite under Kerensky or Admiral Kolchak if given some concessions and incentives for the post-war Russia. But the provisional government was pretty unpopular as they had decided to stay in World War I, so it's kind of unlikely that Kerensky rises to power again or unites the White movement. However, in our timeline, the Bolsheviks had also made a horrible peace deal with the Germans, and in this alternate timeline we'll make the White Army heavily exploit this fact in propaganda against the Bolsheviks. Another change that we could make is if Kolchak accepted more foreign aid from the Entente during the Civil War. In our timeline, Kolchak was highly suspicious of foreign aid as well as the Czechoslovak Legion and thought that the Allied support was a means of puppeting him for the post-war government. However, Kolchak lost the Civil War and was executed. In this alternate timeline, Kolchak accepts as much Allied support as he can get and fully trusts the Czechoslovak Legion. The temporary alliances that we created with anti-Bolshevik socialists like the Green Army and increased ties to separatist movements in Eastern Europe increases White Army strength and unity against the Bolsheviks, but the grievances that all of these movements have against one another, as well as the White movement, will be pushed back until the end of the Civil War, as they would still continue to exist. Okay, so now the White Army has won the Civil War and the Bolsheviks are defeated. What happens now in Russia? After the war, the Whites purged the Reds in Russia in the White Terror, but unlike in our timeline during the Red Terror, the Whites don't have the Cheka or any form of secret police. They could form one, but I think the Whites already have a lot to deal with regardless, and would be under pressure from the Allies to keep purges to a minimum. But, this is Russia. There are going to be a lot of purges anyway. This post-war Russia must rebuild and reform an alliance with the former Entente powers, but the question becomes who runs Russia's new government. Would Russia become a democracy after the Civil War? Well, no. No, it wouldn't. There are a lot of warlord states that are under a weak government. It's likely that a dictatorship under Kolchak emerges or some kind of council of warlords is temporarily formed to keep Russia going. But a lot of warlords have competing interests, and I could see some kind of internal rebellions after the Civil War. But this dictatorship or warlord council would not be permanent, as the population and security forces have many grievances that would need to be properly addressed. Russia would not be aggressive on the world stage or a major power for a while, as there's a lot of internal rebuilding and restructuring that needs to be done. There would not be Stalinist policies, collectivization, or the Great Purges that occurred in our timeline. Instead, Russia relies on foreign support to rebuild and runs the country in whatever form of government and white faction that seized power in the 1930s. It could end up being anything from an anti-Bolshevik leftist government to a monarchist group. Separatist and nationalist movements gain momentum in breakaway states which take advantage of the post-Civil War chaos in their wars of independence. White Russia wouldn't like this, but there's not a whole lot that they can do about it to these states becoming independent and fighting one another for territory. Bolshevism is seen as a failure globally, with the German Revolution and former Soviet republics falling. There are some short-lived Red Scares in Europe and America, but they don't really gain much traction afterwards as the Reds were defeated in the Civil War. World War II would still come, as it was inevitable after the Treaty of Versailles, but fascism and its ideology would not be as against communism as it was in our timeline without the USSR existing, but they'd still definitely be anti-Bolshevik. Maybe in World War II, Bolshevism might try to rise again in Russia after the German invasion in Barbarossa, or it's possible that some Marxists and Bolsheviks go to China to lead communists in the future Cold War for the East, but all that is beyond the scope of this timeline. However, World War II would have some major changes, such as the Russian military wasn't purged of competent leaders and Russia would not conduct the Winter War against Finland, and the Finns could likely join the Allies against the Germans in the Second World War. The war in Europe ends somewhat sooner with a better Russian military, but there's always the unexpected, like interwar White Army leaders competing for power that caused some weaknesses in the Russian army during that time or during World War II. There's just no telling. That's the thing about alternate history when moving forward. You can't fully predict it that well, as slight changes could have disastrous consequences or little to no consequences. What do you think would have happened had the White Army won the Russian Civil War, and what would the effects be? Write in the comments, and thank you for watching.